In the winter of 1907, deep beneath the frozen ground of Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula, a crew of miners was ordered to stop digging, not because the copper had run out. It hadn't. Not because the shaft was unsafe. It wasn't. They were told to seal a passage they had just broken into, to fill the opening with rock and mortar, and to never speak of what waited on the other side. The company records for that section of the mine end abruptly that same year. The maps were redrawn, and a man named Elias Thorne, who swore he found a second way in, spent the rest of his life trying to convince anyone who would listen that beneath the copper country of northern Michigan, someone had been mining long before us, someone who built in cut stone. Today the shaft is flooded, the paperwork is missing, and the official history insists none of this ever happened. But the deeper you dig into what those miners actually pulled out of that ground, the harder that official history becomes to believe. Let's start with something that isn't a mystery at all, because you need it to understand everything that follows. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The copper of the Keweenaw Peninsula is real, and it is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. In most of the world, copper comes out of the rock as an ore, a chemical compound you have to smelt and refine to get the metal. But up here, in this thin finger of land pointing out into Lake Superior, copper comes out of the ground as copper, pure, native. Metal you could theoretically hammer into a blade the day you dug it up. Masses of it have been found weighing hundreds of tons. One single piece, the Ontonagon boulder, sat on a riverbank for who knows how long before it ended up in the Smithsonian, and it weighs over a ton by itself. This is some of the purest, most accessible copper the planet has ever produced. And that fact, that simple geological fact, is the thread that unravels the whole story. Because here is the question that historians have been quietly uncomfortable with for 2 centuries. When European settlers arrived in this region and started digging, they did not find untouched wilderness. They found pits, thousands of them, ancient excavations, already dug, sometimes flooded, sometimes carefully backfilled, running for miles along the copper veins of the Keweenaw and across the water on Isle Royale. Inside those pits, the diggers found stone hammers by the ton, not dozens. Estimates run into the tens of thousands of abandoned hammering stones. Someone had been here before, someone had done a staggering amount of work, and then someone had stopped, all at once, and left almost everything behind. Now the polite, accepted answer is that Native American peoples of the old copper complex mined here thousands of years ago, and that is absolutely true as far as it goes. Indigenous copper working in the Great Lakes is one of the oldest metalworking traditions on the planet, older than a lot of what came out of the so-called cradles of civilization. That part is not the mystery. The mystery is the math. Because when 19th century engineers looked at the sheer volume of rock that had been moved out of these ancient pits, and the sheer tonnage of copper that appeared to be missing from veins that had clearly been worked, they started asking a question nobody had a comfortable answer for. Where did all the copper go? Think about it. You have miles of ancient workings. You have evidence that enormous masses of pure copper were pried loose, lifted, and carried away. The pits are there. The tools are there. But the finished product, the millions of pounds of metal that logic says should have been produced, is simply not accounted for in the archaeological record of the people who supposedly mined it. You find beautiful copper tools and ornaments scattered across North America, yes, but not the quantity the mines imply, not by a long shot. The scale of the extraction and the scale of the surviving artifacts do not match. And when a number doesn't add up, either the number is wrong or the story around it is. To really feel the weight of that question, go out to Isle Royale, the island that sits in Lake Superior, about 50 miles off the Keweenaw shore. It is a wilderness now, a national park where you are more likely to meet a moose than another person. But the whole island is scarred with ancient copper pits, hundreds upon hundreds of them, some driven deep into solid rock. The people who dug them had no metal tools to dig with. They did it with fire and stone and water and patience, building fires against the rock face to heat it, then dashing it with cold lake water to crack it, then battering the loosened stone away with handheld hammers, one blow at a time. For generations. The labor involved is almost impossible to imagine, and they did not do it for a handful of trinkets. They did it at a scale that implies organization, direction, and a destination for the metal that we have never firmly identified. That is the puzzle in its purest form, an ocean of effort and a trickle of surviving results. This is the gap that Elias Thorne fell into, and to understand why one working miner became so obsessed with a hole in the ground, you have to understand the world he was standing in. By 1907, the Keweenaw was not a frontier anymore. It was an industrial machine. The town of Calumet had grown rich enough to build an opera house that hosted acts from New York and Europe. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company was one of the most profitable operations in the entire country, paying dividends that made its shareholders back east genuinely wealthy. Beneath the streets, the mines ran down at an angle for thousands of feet, following the copper lodes deeper and deeper into the earth. The men who worked them were mostly immigrants, Cornish miners who brought their hard rock skills from the tin mines of England. Finns, Italians, Croatians, Slovenians, Germans, all of them chasing the same red metal in the same cold dark. Elias Thorne, by the few accounts that mention him, was Cornish stock, a second-generation miner, the kind of man who had spent his whole life underground and knew rock the way a sailor knows water. And that is the detail that matters. Thorne wasn't a dreamer. He wasn't a treasure hunter who wandered in from the outside with stories. He was a professional who understood exactly what he was looking at when he looked at it. So, when he started telling people that a section of the deep workings didn't make sense, that the rock had been cut in ways rock doesn't cut itself, the men who dismissed him were dismissing one of the most experienced pairs of eyes in the district. Here's what the surviving accounts describe, and I want to be honest with you about where these accounts come from, because that matters. Most of what we have about Thorne does not come from official company documents. The company documents, conveniently, are the ones that go silent. What we have instead are later recollections, a few lines in a local historical society newsletter from decades afterward, a grandson's interview, a single letter that surfaced in an estate sale, fragments. And any honest person has to hold those fragments loosely. But the fragments are consistent, and they are strange in the same specific ways, and that consistency is itself a kind of evidence. According to those accounts, Thorne's crew was extending a drift, a horizontal tunnel, chasing a copper lode that the geology said should keep going, and it did keep going. But as they advanced, the character of the rock changed. The men started noticing that the copper ahead of them had already been worked, not by machines, not by dynamite, which by then was standard. The faces showed the rounded, battered signature of stone hammers and fire setting, the ancient technique of heating rock with flame and cracking it with cold water. They had broken into old workings. That alone was not shocking. Miners hit ancient pits in the Keweenaw more than once, but then, the accounts say, they broke through into a void, an open space. And the open space was not a natural cavern. The walls, Thorne insisted, were dressed, squared, fitted. He described stone laid against stone with joints so tight he could not slide a knife blade between them, the kind of masonry you associate with old-world fortresses and cathedrals, not with a hole in the ground under Lake Superior. And in the center of that space, according to the story he told for the rest of his life, there was a passage leading down, a worked passage with steps, and Thorne, by his own account, went down it, not far, a few steps, holding a carbide lamp out in front of him into air that he said was dead still and cold in a way the mine never was. He described the walls continuing down, dressed and fitted the same way, and at the very edge of his light, before his nerve or his flame gave out, he claimed he could just make out the passage opening into something larger below, a room, or a shaft, or the top of a stair that kept on going. He never got to find out, because that is when the call came down the drift from the captain to pull the men back, and Elias Thorne climbed out of that hole for the last time. Whatever waited below the reach of his lamp, he never saw it again, and neither did anyone else. Now, stop for a second, because this is exactly the moment where a story like this either collapses or gets interesting. A single miner claiming to see impossible masonry underground is a ghost story. It's the kind of tale that circulates in every mining camp in the world. If that were all we had, I'd tell you to file it under folklore and move on. But that is not all we have, because something happened next that is much harder to wave away, and it happened not in a story, but in the paper trail. The paper trail stops. The detailed shaft and level maps that the company kept for that section of the mine, the meticulous engineering records that every serious operation maintained because their entire business depended on knowing exactly where the copper was, simply end for that drift in 1907. Later maps of the same mine show that section as backfilled, abandoned, closed, and the reason given in the sparse notes that do survive is a water problem, flooding. The story on paper is that they hit water. The section became unworkable. They sealed it and moved the workings elsewhere. Miners hit water constantly. It is the single most ordinary thing that can happen underground. So on its own, a flooded and abandoned section is nothing, but here is the friction. The men who were actually down there, in the recollections we have, did not describe a slow flood. They described being pulled off the face suddenly, on orders from above, and being put to work sealing the opening they had just made. They described mortar and cut stone being brought down, which is not how you deal with routine flooding. You do not carefully wall up a flooded drift with masonry. You just leave it and let the water have it. The effort described is the effort of closing something, deliberately, permanently, and then filing paperwork that makes the closing sound boring. And that gap between the boring paper reason and the strange physical effort is the whole case. Because someone spending real money and real labour to seal a passage and then writing it down as nothing is someone who does not want that passage found again. So why would a copper company, an outfit whose only god was the quarterly dividend, wall off a section of a producing mine and lie about it? That question splits into two branches, and both of them are worth walking down. The first branch is the mundane one, and I want to give it its full weight, because the mundane explanation is usually the right one. Mining companies sealed dangerous ground all the time. If Thorne's crew broke into a huge ancient void, that void could have been a catastrophe waiting to happen. Old workings are unstable. They flood, they collapse, they fill with bad air. A company that hit a massive unknown cavity beneath a working mine had every commercial reason in the world to wall it off fast, keep the men away from it, and paper over the whole thing so it never spooked investors or invited lawsuits. Under that reading, there was no ancient masonry, no stairway down. There was a dangerous hole, a nervous mine captain, and a story that grew in the retelling until a flooded pit became a lost city. That is the sober explanation, and it might be the true one. But there is a second branch, and it is the one that the whole revisionist history world has grabbed onto. And to understand it, you have to zoom out from Michigan entirely and look at what was happening to the story of the ancient world in exactly this period. Because 1907 sits at the tail end of one of the strangest chapters in American intellectual history, a chapter that has largely been scrubbed out of the textbooks. Through the 1800s, as settlers pushed west and dug into the ground, they kept finding things that did not fit, enormous earthworks, geometric mounds arranged with mathematical precision, and in the popular imagination, and even in serious scholarship of the time, these were attributed not to Native Americans, but to a vanished race. A lost civilization of mound builders, thought to be older and more advanced, who had supposedly been wiped out or driven off before the tribes the settlers knew ever arrived. Newspapers of that era are full of it. Reports of giant skeletons pulled from mounds. Reports of copper armor, of chambers lined with cut stone, of artifacts that looked, to 19th century eyes, more like the old world than the new. Now, the modern consensus is clear, and it is important to say it plainly. The mound builder myth was, in large part, a lie with a purpose. It was used to justify the taking of native land. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. by arguing that the real superior builders were long gone and the current inhabitants were mere latecomers with no ancestral claim. The earthworks were built by the ancestors of Native Americans. The giant skeleton stories were almost entirely hoaxes, exaggerations, and misidentified mastodon bones. Real archaeology dismantled the whole framework, and good riddance, because it was doing real harm. That is the honest historical record. But here is where it gets slippery. In the process of correctly demolishing a racist myth, did the establishment also become allergic to any anomaly at all? Did the pendulum swing so hard that any inconvenient object, any account that didn't fit, got automatically filed under hoax and forgotten, whether it deserved to be or not? That is the question the revisionists ask. And whatever you think of their answers, the question is not a stupid one, because the historical pattern of the era really was to make anomalies disappear. Reports got buried, artifacts vanished into basement collections and were never catalogued, and a mine company sealing a strange find in 1907 fits that pattern perfectly, whether the find was a genuine wonder or just a dangerous hole. And Thorne's account, strange as it is, does not stand entirely alone. If you go digging through the crumbling newspapers and county histories of the copper era, you find scattered echoes of the same shape. Adrift near another mine that hit worked stone and was quietly abandoned. A crew on Isle Royale that reported a shored-up passage far older than anything they had made, then found the notation struck from the survey. A mine captain's letter, quoted second-hand, warning a colleague not to chase a particular load because of what the last crew found waiting at the bottom of it. None of these are proof. Each one, on its own, is a fragment that a careful historian would set gently aside, but they rhyme. And when enough fragments rhyme, you are at least allowed to ask whether they are echoes of the same buried song. This is the doorway through which the Tartaria idea enters. And you have probably heard the name by now, because it has spread across the internet like groundwater. The core claim of the Tartaria narrative is that there was once a vast, advanced, globe-spanning civilization, technologically and architecturally beyond what the official timeline allows, that was deliberately erased from history within the last few centuries. Its buildings, the argument goes, are still standing all around us, misattributed and relabeled. The grand old railway stations, the state capitals, the domed exhibition halls of the great world's fairs, which the official story says were built of temporary plaster and torn down within a year, despite looking like they took decades of master craftsmanship to raise. The believers look at those fairs, at the White City of the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, at buildings of impossible beauty supposedly thrown up in months and demolished on schedule, and they say, that is not how any of this works. Something is being hidden. I'm not here to sell you Tartaria. There are enormous holes in the theory, and mainstream historians can explain the World's Fair buildings and the architectural styles perfectly well without any lost empire. But I am here to tell you why a story like Elias Thorne's cave lands like a thunderclap inside that worldview. Because if you already believe that an advanced civilization was buried and rewritten, then a sealed chamber of impossible masonry, walled up by a corporation and erased from the maps in 1907, is not an anomaly to be explained away. It is a smoking gun. It is exactly the kind of physical evidence the theory predicts should exist, hidden underground, sealed by the very institutions that supposedly did the rewriting. And this is where the copper comes back. Remember the missing copper. Remember the tens of thousands of stone hammers and the miles of ancient pits and the metal that the archaeology cannot account for. The revisionist reads that gap and says the copper is missing because it was mined at industrial scale by a civilization we have been told did not exist, and shipped somewhere and used for something on a scale that the lost race story of the 19th century was actually a garbled memory of. Under that reading, Thorne didn't stumble into a ghost story. He stumbled into the source, the place the copper actually came from and went to, the deep, engineered heart of the operation that stripped the Keweenaw of a mountain of metal and left almost nothing behind but the tools and the holes. Is that true? I don't know. Neither do you. Neither, honestly, does anyone selling you a video with a confident answer. But let's keep following what happened to Thorne, because the human story is where this stops being an abstraction and starts to ache a little. After the sealing, according to the accounts, Elias Thorne did not let it go, and in a company town that was a dangerous thing to be. The Keweenaw mines were not democracies. The companies owned the housing, the stores, the doctors, and in every way that mattered, the men. To be a troublemaker, to tell a story that embarrassed the company and unsettled the other workers, was to put a target on your own back. The accounts say Thorne was moved to different, worse assignments, that his hours were cut, that the mine captain who had given the sealing order made it quietly clear that his continued employment depended on his continued silence. And for a while, a man with a family to feed does what such men have always done. He went quiet. But he didn't forget. He kept his own notes. He sketched what he remembered of the dressed stone and the descending stair. He wrote down the names of the other men who had been on that shift, so there would be witnesses. And then something happened that turned his private obsession into a much darker thing, because 6 years later, this whole region became the site of one of the worst tragedies in American labor history, and it poisoned everything. In 1913, the copper miners of the Keweenaw went on strike. It was long, it was bitter, and it pitted the immigrant workforce against the enormous power of the companies. And on Christmas Eve of that year, at a party for the striking families packed into the second floor of a building called the Italian Hall in Calumet, someone yelled, "Fire!" There was no fire, but in the panic, in the crush on the stairwell, 73 people died, most of them children. It is a real event. It is one of the darkest days in the history of this country's working people, and to this day nobody was ever held accountable for who shouted that false alarm or why. Suspicion has always pointed toward men connected to the companies, trying to break the strike by breaking the strikers' spirit. Nothing was ever proven. I bring up the Italian Hall not to tie it to Thorne's cave with some neat conspiratorial bow, because that would be dishonest and it would insult the memory of those children. I bring it up because it tells you exactly what kind of world Elias Thorne was living in, a world where the men who ran these mines had shown, in the most horrifying way imaginable, that they would go to appalling lengths to control their workforce and protect their operations. In a place where 73 people could die on a stairwell and no one would ever answer for it, the idea that a company would wall up an inconvenient hole and threaten one stubborn miner into silence stops sounding like a wild theory. It starts sounding like a Tuesday. After 1913, the copper country never fully recovered its old dominance. The richest lodes were playing out. Cheaper copper was coming from open pit mines out west and from mines in Chile and Africa. The great companies contracted. The population of Calumet, which had once dreamed of becoming a major American city, began its long, slow drain. Buildings emptied, the opera house went dark. And in that fading town, an aging miner, with a story nobody wanted to hear, became easier and easier to ignore. The accounts say Elias Thorne died sometime in the 1920s, poor, mostly forgotten, still insisting to anyone who would sit with him that there was a chamber under the old workings that the company had sealed and lied about. He had, by then, the reputation of a crank, the man who saw the underground city. Children were told he was touched in the head, and when he died his notes and his sketches passed to his family, and there they sat, in a box, for decades, which is the fate of almost every inconvenient piece of evidence in this entire field. Not destroyed, not disproven, just set aside, in an attic, until everyone who cared was dead too. And that is very nearly where the trail goes cold for good, but every so often one of these boxes gets opened. The way the story reaches us at all is that decades later, a local historian working on a book about the vanished copper towns was going through material donated by old mining families, and among the estate papers of a Cornish household he found a bundle of a miner's notes and rough sketches wrapped in oilcloth, sketches of a squared stone chamber, a rough map of a drift, with one section circled, and beside it, in a shaking older hand, 4 words, sealed 1907. They lied. The historian could not verify a single line of it. He could not match it cleanly to any surviving company map, because the relevant maps for that section, as we keep finding, do not survive. He gave it a few paragraphs in a book with a tiny print run, and then it slipped back into the dark. The sketches have never been formally studied. No geologist has walked that ground. The one physical trace of Elias Thorne's life work is a bundle of yellowed paper that most of the people who could actually evaluate it have never even heard exists. That, more than anything, is how this works. Not a grand conspiracy with men in suits burning documents in a locked room, just neglect and distance and the quiet certainty that it cannot be real, doing the same job a shredder would do. And that would be the end of it. A sad little regional legend, except for one more wrinkle. Because the flooded, sealed section of that mine is still down there. The Keweenaw is full of abandoned workings, thousands of miles of tunnels running under the peninsula, most of them now filled with water, sealed off, or collapsed. Modern exploration of them is difficult, dangerous, and legally complicated, since the land and the old mineral rights are a tangled mess of private ownership and liability. The specific drift that Thorne described, if the accounts even preserve its true location, sits somewhere in that dark, flooded labyrinth, behind a wall that a crew built in 1907, under a company's orders, for reasons the paperwork records as nothing more interesting than water. So what do we actually have when we strip away both the skeptic's certainty and the believer's fantasy and just look at what's left on the table? We have a real place that really did produce some of the purest copper on Earth. We have real, undisputed ancient mining on a scale that has genuinely puzzled serious people for 200 years, and a real, unresolved question about where all that metal ended up. We have a real historical period obsessed with lost civilizations, and a real, documented habit of institutions making anomalies quietly disappear. We have a real corporate power structure in the Keweenaw that was proven capable of monstrous things. And sitting in the middle of all of that, we have the fragmentary, unverifiable, but strangely consistent account of one experienced miner who said he found a worked chamber in the deep rock and a paper trail that goes conveniently silent in exactly the year he says it was sealed. The skeptic says every single one of those pieces has an ordinary explanation, and that stringing them together into a story is just pattern making, the thing human brains do compulsively in the dark. And the skeptic might be completely right. The believer says that when this many ordinary explanations have to line up in a row to keep the official story standing, at some point the official story is doing more work than the anomalies. And the believer might be right too. That is the honest, uncomfortable shape of this thing. It is not a solved case pretending to be a mystery. It is a genuine gap in the record, sitting under hundreds of feet of black water. Here is what I keep coming back to. History, the version in the textbooks, presents itself as a finished building. Clean lines, every stone accounted for, the blueprint complete. But anyone who has actually gone looking knows that history is not a building. It is a mine. It is a dark, flooded, half-collapsed network of tunnels, where most of what was ever dug is now sealed off or lost, where the maps were drawn by the people who owned the operation, and where the sections that got walled up are exactly the sections we can no longer check. We are told, with great confidence, what is down there. But confidence is not the same as knowledge, and every so often a man like Elias Thorne comes back up from the deep, covered in dust, saying he saw something the map insists was never there. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he was a tired man who saw shapes in the rock and spent his life chasing a shadow. But the shaft is still flooded. The records are still missing. The wall the company built in 1907 is still standing in the dark. And until someone drains that water and knocks that wall down and shines a light on what is actually behind it, the only honest thing any of us can say is that we do not know. And in a world that is so certain about the shape of the past, sitting with that one small, cold, unanswered question might be the most important thing you do all day. Because the ground beneath the story we were told is a lot more hollow than we have ever been allowed to see.